Hi, welcome to the Telesummit. Katie, how are you today?
I'm fine. How are you, Phil?
Great. And for our viewers, I just want to say that Katie is a prolific and brilliant artist, cartoonist, jewelry designer, and she comes to this issue as also as an activist. She has worked with the International Solidarity Movement in Palestine and in the United States. So welcome.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks for agreeing to interview me. As I was doing these interviews with other people, I realized that I actually have quite a bit to say on this subject myself.
Yeah, it's great to be interviewed. I agree with you. And it's important for creative people to get interviewed because it helps them understand how they're perceived in the world, how their ideas are perceived in the world. So it's my pleasure to turn the tables on you. So I guess first, can you tell me why do you feel so passionately about this issue, and what does that reflect in your personal history? Uh, yeah, why are you here?
I feel so strongly about this issue because I actually went to Palestine and I lived through some of the horrific situations that Palestinians have to live through every day. And there's this phrase that kind of gets thrown about in the media, the phrase like, where was he radicalized or where was she radicalized? And it's kind of a silly phrase, but to be honest, when you actually go to Palestine, or if you're Palestinian yourself, or like you, Phil, as a journalist, when you go there and you see what's happening, you can't help but get radicalized. And I actually don't even think radicalized is a good term for it. That's like a label that the media throws onto people who have opinions and beliefs and experiences that don't conform to the mainstream. What I think it is just that our eyes have been opened to the reality of what it's like for so many people, and our tax dollars are funding this, and it's just, frankly, it's unacceptable. Like, we cannot accept this situation. And I couldn't return to the United States and just continue my life like nothing had happened and go back to being like a goth girl in San Francisco and just carry on. I just couldn't do that.
Well, but tell me when that, forgive me for breaking in, but tell me when that was and why you went in the first place if you were a goth girl in San Francisco.
It was 2005 that I went for the first time, and I had been working as a freelance illustrator in San Francisco, working for bands, doing CD covers, posters, stuff like that.
Great.
And I went to training, an international solidarity movement training in Berkeley in 2005, and I didn't have any intention of going to Palestine at the time because I couldn't afford it. But I went to this training and I was just blown away by what they were talking about. You know, they were talking about undetaining people at checkpoints. They were talking about riding in ambulances with shot or injured Palestinians and negotiating with the soldiers at the checkpoints to get the ambulances through.
Mm, mm,
And they really showed me what a difference one
mm,
person can make.
mm,
And
mm. Heroic work, just heroic, let's say that.
and I just decided I had to be a part of this. And I sold all of my goth records and CDs, and I bought a ticket to Palestine. So I kind of left that whole life behind. And
Interesting. Interesting. Wow. Um, and so how do you explain that 13 years later, and I'm sorry to be so personal, but that's what interests me chiefly. I mean, as a uh, toehold to getting to some of the more activist ideological issues that we'll get to in this conversation. But How do you explain that 13 years on, you are still so invested in this issue? How has it burned bright for you, and have other issues come close in your commitment
No
meter?
other issues have come as close because no other issues have hit me this personally. I've been active in various social movements in the US for many years, but I never experienced the brutality and the unfairness and the violence that here in the US that I experienced over there. And that just changes a person. You can't forget that, and you can't forget your friends back there who don't have another passport and they can't leave. They
Mm-hmm.
have
Mm-hmm.
to deal with
Mm-hmm.
this situation every day, a situation
Mm-hmm.
that I could escape from when it got to be too much for me.
Yes. Um, and last personal question before we move on. What about Islam? Is that an important component of your engagement politically, or is it? I mean, I say this as someone whose Jewishness has been very important to my engagement on this
Yeah,
question.
it has been. I think all the great religions have a social component to them. We're supposed to help those who are less fortunate than we are. And
God knows that's true.
yeah.
Um, well, Katie, what about how, you've just described some pretty horrible things. Oh, let me just ask before we pass along to the next point. You came to ISM in 2005. When did you first hear the name Rachel Corrie, and what was the impact of her story on your own decisions about joining up with ISM?
I first heard of Rachel Corrie when she was martyred in 2003. I think it was March of 2003.
Yes.
And her name came up in the alternative and independent media that I was reading
Hmm.
at the time. And that's when I first heard of the International Solidarity Movement. And,
Hmm.
I kept them on my radar, on and off. I liked what they were
Yeah.
doing. I was definitely interested. I never thought I would end up over there, but
Yes.
I did. And it
Got it.
was one of the best decisions of my life.
Uh-huh. Um, why do you say it was one of the best decisions of your life?
I developed as a person so much more by living in Palestinian society and going through what they were going through and seeing an aspect to American imperialism that we don't get here in America.
Mm-hmm.
We have a certain idea of what it's like to be an American here in this country. But when
Mm-hmm.
we go and live somewhere else where the effects of American foreign policy are so dramatic and so brutal, it really changed what it meant to be as an American for me.
Mm. Mm. Interesting. Thank you for that. That's a great answer. Do you ever think of the alternative, Katie Miranda, who's risen to fame as a in the music industry through her CD covers and sets for bands playing around the country?
When I was a teenager, I was actually in a band and I enjoyed playing music, but like making CD covers, that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I did a few of them, but it's not the way my life turned out, and I'm fine with that. I can
Okay.
still do CD covers, I'm
Yeah. Hey.
still
Hey. Yeah.
available for that.
Great. That's great.
I'm doing a lot of other things too that are really meaningful, and I wouldn't trade that for anything.
Great. So, what? Let's pivot, as they say in Washington. What do you think? What gives you hope? How hopeful are you about the movement freedom in Palestine. And what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that, no empire lasts forever. And if you look at South Africa, if you look at the colonization of Algeria, those are all over. And
Yes.
this Israeli apartheid, it's not going to last forever. And the reason I believe that is because it's morally wrong. It's against God. And it doesn't matter which God you believe in. I think it's all the same God personally, but it's against natural law. It can't continue like this. I don't know if it's going to have to get worse for it to get better, but I'm not going to give up because people in Gaza aren't giving up. People in Hebron aren't giving up.
Hmm.
So,
But are there specific events that have happened? I'm a journalist and a writer, so I am very and I have to produce journalism every day about this. So I'm very topically oriented and headline oriented and that sort of thing. So I don't mean to impose my consciousness on yours at all, but are there events over the last few years or last few months for that matter that give you greater hope about this or greater despair?
well, I want to talk about what I think is working in this movement
Okay,
and what isn't. So I'm going to talk about that, and I think it's a little bit related to your question.
it is definitely, yes.
BDS is definitely working, and there are other speakers on this telesummit who've talked more in depth about that. I think the recent cancellations of people who are supposed to participate in this music festival are
Hmm.
huge. That's going to keep continuing to happen. And
Yes,
eventually, the Israeli government is going to have to do something about it. And it's going to be beyond just harassing activists in the US because that's not working, clearly.
yes.
Um, I think the other thing that is really working in the movement is international solidarity on the ground in Palestine. And that takes the form of organizations like the International Solidarity Movement, like Christian peacemaker teams, like the Ecumenical Accompaniers, who all these organizations work on the ground with Palestinians in Palestine and resist the occupation forces and the settlers through nonviolent means. And what's accomplished by these individuals and these groups, it very rarely makes the international media unless it's hugely dramatic. But all the small acts, I believe, they really add up and they have ripple effects. And I'm just going to tell a story about something. I wasn't actually there, but I knew people who were, and it was huge, and I'll never forget it. This was in 2007 in, I think it was Balata refugee camp. There were about 7 or 8 ISM activists who had been sent to Balata because the army was going to invade, and they lined up on the street. The streets are really narrow. There's about 7 or 8 of them. They sat down in the road and they prevented an Israeli army jeep from entering the camp.
Wow.
And I saw the video of this, and it was just like my hands were sweating when I watched this because
Mm,
the jeep came up within inches of their face and it was revving its engine, and they didn't get up.
mm,
They stayed
mm,
there. And
mm.
eventually, one of the women activists, she got up and she spoke to the soldiers in the Jeep. And she was telling them, look, there are kids in this camp. You don't need to invade. And they stayed there until the Jeep eventually backed
Wow.
up down the road and left.
Yeah.
And this didn't make the international media. I don't even know if I could find the video. I wanna find it, and if I do, I'll put it in the comments below. But
Send me a link too.
yeah, if I can find it. Um,
Sure.
but there were Palestinians who saw this, and I know that they were encouraged by this because a lot of times they feel like the world has abandoned them.
Hmm.
And it's acts like this which have the effect of, it. I believe it really affects Palestinians to know that there are people who come from
It does.
abroad and do these actions. Um, there, Eva Bartlett in Gaza, she worked with ISM in Gaza for several years, and there are videos of her going out on Palestinian fishing boats because the fishing boats were frequently shot at by the Israeli Navy. And she would go out there with, her yellow vest and her bullhorn, and she would say to the Israeli Navy, "Look, we are a peaceful fishing boat. These fishermen just want to catch fish so that they can feed their families." And there are other videos of her escorting farmers in Gaza out to their fields. She was doing the same thing. She was talking to these soldiers up in their sniper towers and telling them not to shoot. And this is huge.
Hmm.
I wonder what would have happened in Gaza during these last few months if there were 50 international people there.
Hmm.
I wonder
Hmm.
how things would have turned out, if they would have been any different. I think they would
Hmm.
have been.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
But Israel has kept those people out of there.
yeah, but there's always more people to come in, and
Yes.
I
Yeah.
hope that somebody watching this gets encouraged or inspired to go. We've had volunteers of all ages. Well, you have to
Hmm.
be 18
Hmm.
to join ISM, but we've had volunteers all the way up to into their 80s who
Hmm.
volunteered with ISM. Some people might have heard of Hetty Epstein. She was an ISM activist, and she made several trips to
Hmm. Hmm.
Palestine to work with ISM, and she was in her 80s.
Hmm.
And our senior volunteers are actually very effective because they can talk to and reason with soldiers like they talk to their grandkids.
Hmm.
And that's something that those of us who are younger, we can't do.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
So, what about people who say that, back to the BDS point, that BDS isn't working? What do you, that it's not affecting Israel economically, that Israel's this technological powerhouse that only gets stronger, it only gets more money from the United States and its economy, et cetera, et cetera. You've heard the argument. What do you say to that?
I'm not an economist, and I'm not particularly good with numbers. Um, so I can't really make a comment on how much this is hurting the Israeli economy. But I am a consumer of the news, and I have seen all the news that this recent concert has gotten. Lana Del Rey was paid $700,000, I think. That's what I read, to perform in this concert. That's just one artist. So this
Hmm.
concert was supposed to generate a lot of revenue for the producers. And this is just one concert.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the dollar amount, it's about the symbolism.
Yes.
People remember the anti apartheid struggle in the 80s, and people who may not know very much about Israel Palestine will know that in the 80s we were boycotting South Africa for this very same reason.
Yes. Yes. And I would say, I would inject here, I think Lana Del Rey is a wonderful performer, singer, songwriter, and she comes out of an activist background. It's really, it's unfortunate that she even made the gig, but it's a wonderful thing that she did what she did. It takes a lot of strength, and I just wish her the best in her career.
Yeah, yeah.
What isn't working in your view in terms of activism or movement building or solidarity activities?
I've given a lot of thought to this, and I actually prepared a lot of notes to for this conversation I wanted to have. What's not working is the interactivist bullying and the drama. And what I mean by that is we have to learn to work together with people who don't always have the same views on issues that we do. I believe that everyone in this movement has something intelligent to say and something to contribute. And that's the truth. And we have to make space for everybody who wants to participate. And we're not always going to agree with everyone. But when we name call, when we criticize people, when we attack them personally on the internet, when we make fun of their physical appearance, like, God, I can't even believe that people do this in our movement. When we call for some speaker to be banned from speaking, what we're doing is we're creating this theater on the internet. That's what it is. It's theater. It's drama that other people can watch and other people can consume and participate in the bullying if they want to. And when that happens, we've forgotten the real reason that we came into this movement. We've forgotten that the real reason we got involved is to support Palestinian freedom. Because when we're involved in drama and when we're fighting with other people in our movement and criticizing them, it's all about our own egos and satisfying that need to criticize and to put other people down publicly. It's no longer about Palestinians, and that's a
Right.
huge problem.
Okay, but why isn't that just an eternal problem in any sort of human organizing? And I'm sure that if you studied, I mean, I have to somewhat, some degree, studied the history of abolitionism in the United States. There were terrible sectarian divides there, and Lincoln, whatever he was not an abolitionist, was disavowing that movement. Others were disavowing. So I take hope from that and thinking, well, some of this division and sniping and bullying is just kind of, it's because there are human beings involved. What do you say to that?
I think all human beings have a need to consume drama. But if you want to consume drama, there are more constructive ways to do that. You can watch reality television if you really need to consume drama. And we all have an individual choice. We can choose to disagree with somebody and do it respectfully. We can say, I don't agree with your position on that, but I don't want to argue anymore. And we can just disengage. It's a choice that we all can make. We don't have to participate in bullying. We don't have to name call. And
well, by that, but could you also fault Palestinians for not forging a unity agreement of Fatah and Hamas? There are divisions all over the world that have real political effects. Do you follow where I'm going here?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the divisions in Palestinian society are a huge issue, and that's something that they really need to iron out and work on. And when I interviewed Hanan Ashrawi, she talked a little bit about that. But if I criticize and critique Palestinian society, I'm not going to have 1 ounce of effect on their society because I'm not Palestinian and I don't live there. Where I can have an effect is within my own community. And so it's important for me to say, look, this divisiveness and this meanness, it's really setting us back, and it's a choice that we make. We don't have to behave this way towards each other.
Just so we have a sense of proportion here, because I don't, I understand the issue you're talking about, but how pervasive is this problem, and how much has it changed over the years, and how much does it disfigure organizing, in your view?
Well, I don't have any tools to measure how pervasive it is. I can just speak from my own personal anecdotal experience. Watching some of these dramas unfold on the internet, I think it's very, very serious. I think the movement has been split on the issue of Syria, which I think is a tragedy. And of course, we don't want to work with immoral people. We don't want to work with people who are doing things that are morally wrong or detrimental to the cause. But there's a difference between an immoral person and somebody that we have a disagreement with. And to tar and feather and socially ostracize people that we have some kind of ideological disagreement with over something really minor. And trust me, it's minor. You know, when we're lying on our deathbed and we're looking back over our lives, what's important in our lives at that time, it's not going to be this little teeny tiny petty disagreement that we remember.
Hmm.
That's what I mean by it's really minor. And we need to be bigger than that and move past it.
So, you mentioned Syria. Do you think that the intensity of that divide has ebbed now that the sort of outcome is a fait accompli in Syria?
I don't know because I haven't been involved personally in any of that kind of division. There are some
Hmm.
people that I'm going to be interviewing on this telesummit who I think would be able to answer that question better.
Hmm. I see. Um, so I think we're getting close to my last questions, which are uh, have to do. I want to be a little bit more optimistic at the end. I don't want to end on a negative issues because I think that both you and I are very hopeful about what we've been observing in terms of the movement in the United States. And I'm wondering about your own. Have you observed changes in your own community around the Israel-Palestine question?
It's hard to say what my own community is because I'm involved in so many different communities. You know, I'm involved in the Muslim community. I have Jewish friends. I have Christian family members. But since I got involved, I've noticed that there's much more openness to this issue, and people who are not involved in the activism know a lot more than than they did, 13 years ago. Um,
Can
one
you give me a couple of can you give me some examples of that awareness or just an example?
an example would be like non-activists who aren't active on any particular issue. They can talk to me about Palestine, and I'm surprised at how much they know. And that didn't used to be the way it was back in um, 2005 when I first got involved. It's like Palestine was a four-letter word. You couldn't say it.
Uh-huh. But I interrupted you. You were moving on to, I think, a broader sense of the community, or you said that one thing was that you're seeing greater awareness on, in the community. But is there what about the change in, say, you mentioned family too. Do you see people who are getting engaged who were not engaged before?
Well, my dad came to visit me in Palestine uh,
I
in
didn't know that.
in 2007. Yeah, and that was a big event in his life. I think he
Wow.
he
Wow.
was sympathetic to the cause before, but he didn't have any information other than what's mostly um, produced in the mainstream media. He knew a little bit more than your average
Hmm.
person, but he came and he spent 2 weeks with me there, and he's a Republican, and he's totally on board with the
Wow.
Palestinian cause now. So that brings me to the question of why is this a partisan issue? This is this shouldn't be a partisan issue. It shouldn't be like liberals versus right wing. It's a human rights issue. And
Yes.
anybody who goes over there and sees what's happening is going to understand that, like my father.
Yes. And but I mean, you made that great comparison earlier in this discussion to Algeria and South Africa and other immoral practices, regimes that were in force. So both those struggles took a long time, as I, have discovered, and then they changed very quickly, actually, in both cases, because of key factors. Do you ever think about where we're at in that timeline? Or obviously, you can't take a rigid uh, standard from those struggles to this one, but do you do you think about that?
I think
And do
about
you,
it a lot. And I read Nelson Mandela's autobiography twice now. On my
mhm,
last
Long Road to
teles,
Freedom.
yeah, on my last telesummit, I interviewed Ahmed Kathrada, who was Nelson Mandela's friend and cellmate, and unfortunately, he passed away a couple
Mm,
of years ago. So I think about this a lot, and I want to go back to what I was saying before about working with people of diverse viewpoints. If we think about the person who was the most successful in the history of the world on the issue of ending apartheid, it would be Nelson Mandela, right?
I agree with you.
So the reason he was so successful is because he would work with anybody who supported his cause. He worked with Gaddafi, he worked with Fidel Castro, he worked with Yasser Arafat, and people called him out for this. But guess what? In the end, he won. Like,
Hmm.
he really won.
Hmm.
And he wasn't the type of person who was so narrow and closed minded that he wouldn't work with somebody who had an ideological difference with him.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I think about that a lot.
What about liberal Zionists in that construct of coalition building?
I think we have to work with them. And I think there
Hmm.
may be people out there who would be mad at that notion. And in the past, I wouldn't have said that because in the past I was much more rigid.
What changed?
You know, after I got back from Palestine, I was really, really depressed and I could hardly get out of bed. And what kind of saved me was not just Islam, but I got really into personal development. Authors like Wayne Dyer and Louise Hay, Anthony Robbins, and Don Miguel Ruiz, Thich Nhat Hanh, and all all these people. What I've learned from them is that what you put out into the world is exactly what you're going to get back. And if you're putting out drama and pettiness and I won't work with you because you don't believe this exact thing, that's what you're going to get back. And there are so many people that I've seen that used to be Zionists who are no longer Zionists. And if I had just said, well, that person's a Zionist, I'm not going to talk to them, well, maybe they wouldn't have changed their mind
Mm,
because I never
mm,
got a chance to talk to them.
that's a beautiful statement. I appreciate what that teaching that you got from those authors. That's really, I think it's powerful.
I would really
Uh,
encourage anybody listening to this to read books by all those people.
mhm, mhm. So Katie, tell me, is there anything that issue that we've touched on that you haven't felt like I gave you enough of an opportunity to explore? And if so, here's your last chance.
I think that's it. Yeah, we've covered
Okay.
everything that I really wanted to talk about that's important. I could go on for another half an hour, but I want to keep these interviews
Well,
to 30 minutes because people have short attention spans.
So, Katie, thank you so much. That was a great answer, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the openness and bravery of your comments. I've always known you to be a religious person, and I think that that was the strength of our conversation was your discussion of the sort of spiritual consciousness issues that are so important if one is going to be a mature and effective activist. And you, you hit on them, and you did it in a really moving way. So thank you.
Thanks, Phil.